Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to wherever you're tuning in around the world for our latest Reuters event supply chain webinar. The topic for today's discussion is one of the hottest issues in global supply chain right now, port congestion. So much has been said about this issue. It's been a staple in news programs and pub conversations all around the world. So today promises to be a very lively conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce each of the panelists, starting off with Frank from Agility. If you can give us a quick introduction on yourself and your organization, please, Frank.
Sure. My name is Frank Clary. I'm Vice President of Sustainability. I manage Agility's sustainability program. We're a global logistics and supply chain company. And there's a lot of interrelationships between sustainability, port congestion, and port efficiency.
Excellent. Appreciate you joining us, Frank. And next up, John Esborn, if you can give us a quick introduction on yourself and Perch, please.
Sure, thank you. John Esborn, Head of International Transportation for Perch. Perch is a new emerging market, in a new emerging market, often referred to as an Amazon aggregator. Basically, there are companies that are stepping in and buying up sellers on Amazon and building larger companies out of that and gaining efficiencies and then going multi-channel and into new countries and growing what someone else, an entrepreneur, built, got started building on their own, and we kind of take it to the next generation.
Excellent. Appreciate you joining us, John. And next up, Jamin, if you can give us a quick introduction on yourself and your organization, please.
Sure. I'm Jamin Dick, and I lead supply chain for Alibaba.com in North America. And Alibaba.com is, for the last 20 years, has been a place for buyers and sellers to meet each other and to do business cross border. So I'm very happy to be here today.
Excellent. Appreciate you joining us. And last but not least, John Motley, if you can give us a quick introduction on yourself and Lognet, please.
Thank you, Nick. I'm John Motley, founder and CEO of Lognet. We're a leading autonomous 4PL platform. We specialize in including a single platform for real-time end-to-end visibility into production, documents, inventory, transportation, supply, demand, the whole shoot and match.
Excellent. Appreciate you joining us today, John. So today's topic is something that obviously is making news headlines all around the world. Starting off with Frank, I'd love for you to just give us a quick explanation and discussion of how you see the current situation within the context of your experience in supply chain.
It's unheard of. I've been in the industry for a long time. The amount of congestion we're seeing is super high. It's having an impact across all aspects of the supply chain. It's affecting inventory. It's affecting ordering. It's affecting trucking. It's affecting air freight. Everything is being impacted by this. This is, effectively, it's almost like it's a World War II situation right now in terms of the economic impact we're seeing, particularly in some markets. It also has this global impact. So what's happening in LA is affecting container availability for the rest of the world, and conversely, what's happening in Rotterdam is affecting stuff around the world. So this is really, really something that's unheard of. I think that a lot of people were probably predicting this 2 years ago when we started to go into lockdowns and stuff, and hopefully that those people were able to manage and prepare for it. But yeah, this is something. It's huge. It's something that we haven't really seen previously, in my opinion.
Perfect. Appreciate that. John, just bring yourself in from the Perch perspective. How do you say this current situation compares, given what you've seen over your experience in supply chain?
The word anomaly came up at one point along the way recently, and I think this whole event is an anomaly. It's unprecedented. Although I think that there were kind of indications in a way that it was coming, and I'll use the example of the bridge was raised in New York, and so now we're all excited because we can bring a 14,000 TEU vessel in. Well, those containers have to come off and go on terminals that don't have any more land than they did previously. I mean, the ability to move them off dock and the infrastructure efficiencies, it's just the ripple effect. I mean, you fix a highway and add a new on-ramp, and you just move the problem down the highway further, right? And so that's what we've created for ourselves, and we were all kind of parties to the event, from that standpoint. So as far as how long is it going to go, I don't see this. I don't see it getting any better next year. You know, I mean, little tidbits of better, but little small steps. But in general, we're in this for a while.
Definitely. Jamin, just from your perspective to John and Frank's points there, how much of an anomaly do you see the current situation, and how long do you expect this to continue?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what others have said here. You know, I think there have been periodic supply chain disruptions, you know, at any given year. This is different. This feels very different to me. The constraints that we're seeing are across the board. And I think, you know, everyone's understanding how complex and interdependent the entire global supply chain is. I think it's an education for a lot of us too, to see that when, you know, one thing breaks, what a ripple effect it has on everything else. So it's a bit of a perfect storm, and I agree it's going to last. This won't be weeks. This is going to be months, and hopefully we can get it sorted out in the next year. But I think it's going to last a while.
John, just from your perspective at Lognet, just to the panelists' points here, how long do you expect the current situation to last? Yeah, John, if you can unmute yourself there.
Sorry about that. It's like John mentioned and Jamin mentioned. I think John pointed to the ripple effects, and no doubt that's definitely happening. And we've noticed a lot of, I guess, signal to noise ratio where it's all so much noise. And digging through the data to understand what's happening, that's really our role in the IT space. And we've seen things like a lot of customers move to ship early out of, say, Indonesia when they had their lockdowns, and that caused a bubble of freight. So we've got customers that are watching to make sure that year-over-year increases are really a year-over-year increase and not a bubble. So, for example, the Port of Los Angeles managed 10% less this October than last October, but certainly they're not in anywhere near a good environment. But their ability to handle those bubbles that came through created the tangled web of shoreside activity with seaside and intermodal. Other ports around the world have different capability, and being able to have those established and set up to manage through those, our clients are getting around that and managing through that. So it's been a tremendous learning curve. But importantly, some of the noise, some of the behavior amongst the carrier community has really been surprising. We've noticed, for example, the port call count of various transits increasing, meaning basically they're dumping freight to go back and get more at the origin. They're just trying to optimize the flow, but the impact to the customers, there's no chance that those containers that are dropped off in Cristobal, Spain, for example, have any chance of getting delivered on time. But it is optimizing the carrier's network.
Great points. I think that's something we're going to expand upon later in the conversation. John, just from the Perch perspective, the Port of LA has almost become kind of a pop culture meme, given everything that we've seen. Just from your perspective, why are we still sending product to known choke points like the Port of LA?
I think the first and foremost is that's where people's assets are. Their brick and mortar, their warehousing, right? And they've built their distribution network around the Port of LA. And so they want their container there. Could they go in through Oakland or some other port? Sure, they could, but that adds costs, and ideally, they're fighting to be able to get on that vessel that's going into Los Angeles. So can you locate in other ports? Sure, but now that's more of a long-term strategy that you need to acquire space and turn on a warehouse and whatnot. Or if you hire a 3PL, chances are they may not have space because the 3PLs their warehouses are full as well.
Definitely. Jamin, I'd love to hear your perspective on this choke point issue.
Yeah, I think about it like, I-90 or Heathrow Airport. If you had I-90 shut down for some reason for a week, you couldn't just divert all of that traffic into, the smaller roads. Or same thing with some large airport like Heathrow, it is an infrastructure capacity issue. And so when you have 40% of all U.S. containers coming through two ports in LA and Long Beach, that you just can't divert all of that and solve it easily. Now, for individual shippers and importers, there may be options, but overall, the supply chain issues are, you still have to have capacity on the 3PLs and the vessels and the number of berths and how the different people unloading and trucking. So all of those things, there's so many variables that most ports are not equipped to handle, to take off the backlog. So I think it's a complex problem. People don't have easy choices, and so I think it's going to take some time for us to sort it out, us being collectively in supply chain. And to solve problems on an individual basis while we're trying to figure out the kind of broader infrastructure issues.
Perfect. Great points there, Jamin. Frank, just from your perspective, obviously we're seeing a lot of challenges in the ports. From your perspective, how can companies build in flexibility to mitigate against some of these disruptions when it comes to the transportation planning process?
So the first thing I would suggest is get good data, so you can make better decisions. And good data is going to be reliant a lot on one, collaboration with your supply chain partners, and two, good technology and making sure that you have the good software platforms that you can actually get good data to make really, really good decisions. And that will help you manage your demand, your supply, and some sort of predictability. And I think that's like critically important. And now we're seeing a lot more, the advent of a lot more real technologies and artificial intelligence and big data analytics that you can use for this. I'd love to hear John's opinion on this, John from Lognet. But data is critical. This, if you can't measure it, then you can't manage it, and this is no exception to that rule. And then the other thing is technology, automation, utilization, making sure you can manage your schedule and your demand and your planning. And this can help one overcome some of these short-term issues that we're looking at for the next 12 months or so, but also long-term issues. And if it's really advisable to start looking at metrics, analytics, good data, and technology right now.
Definitely. I think that's great points on short-term and long-term. John, just from the Lognet perspective, what would you add to what Frank mentioned?
I think, Frank hit a major point there. For us, we look at it as how you're looking at things cross-functionally, and that are your KPIs end-to-end, and you have everyone accountable end-to-end. And we counsel customers to use a 6-point assessment of real-time visibility. So there's sort of your basic real-time visibility, which is where's the boat at. But we encourage clients to look at production and getting production data into the mix with the transport data, getting all of the departure information, which might have to be dealing with export customs and documentation at the origin, so that you're integrating that export data with the import data on the other side. And then the delivery portion, it doesn't do much good if the International Transportation Department gets it to the destination port, but the distribution department can't deliver it to the customer for whatever reason. And joining them together in joint KPIs is really important. But having sort of that 6-point intensive real-time visibility that's the kind of looks at everything from production to delivery, documentation, mixing all of that together. We also think that when you, I think as Jamin was talking about, you've got to, on an intermediate or long-term basis, take a look at what is your backup port of entry amongst your carriers. If you don't have a carrier, for example, that could go to Prince Rupert, where the Canadian rails have some pretty good connections into the US Midwest, for example, not having a carrier that has them as that area as an option, I think we're going to see a lot more contingency planning, especially when there's a sustained disruption like the pandemic.
Appreciate those points, John. Jamie, I'd love to hear your perspective on what Frank and John mentioned there around the technologies and the short-term and long-term planning on these issues.
Yeah, I think that, they hit some really important ones there. I think, digitization of as much of the supply chain to maximize the amount of visibility you have, the ability to leverage data for better planning and, as you mentioned, backup planning. I think that's a big part of it. And probably if I had to choose one thing, it would be that, no surprise from Alibaba, that's what we think about all the time. But I do think there's an operational component here as well, which is, building in more buffer time and building in buffer stock into your planning. These are things that are hard to swallow sometimes, and it's sort of the anti lean supply chain to build in buffer stock. But I think we are in a unique period here, and there, when you're dealing with containers that cost 5 times what they did a year ago, you want to make sure that they're all full and that you have some ability to absorb some of the shocks that are happening. So I do think that there's an operational component as well as a digitization and data component.
Definitely. I think that the buffer stock topic is very, very interesting. John, would love to hear, obviously, at Perch, what you're doing, and also some of the experiences in previous organizations you've worked with on how to navigate this challenge.
I heard someone use in kind of piggybacking on the others, just in time has become just in case. I can't remember where I heard that quote, but get your extra inventory in just in case. And of course, we need it from that standpoint because of the disruption in the supply chain. And so as far as dealing with it, different ways, different approaches. So buying contracts earlier, looking, from a contracting standpoint to make sure, I guess the first point would be make sure you've got space you need. And how do you do that? I was fairly successful in an earlier role in getting space for our scale, which was dramatic. It was threefold from 25,000 to 75,000 global containers a year ago. So how do we scale to cover that kind of growth in this environment? We went to market earlier. We signed different types of contracts, multiple year contracts. There were some guarantees built in there, but an absolute different look at the traditional Trans-Pacific May to April contract. And I was at an event recently where a senior vice president for one of the ocean carriers stated to me that he felt the selling contracting season for the most part for them was going to be over in December, which last year it was over in February, early March, and typically it's over in late April, mid-May, because the contracts run, Trans-Pacific May to April. So you just got to take a different look in terms of making sure you've got capacity, and then within your contracts, can you build in flexibility in how your capacity is allocated? Not to get too far down a thread, but most carriers typically want to give you an allocation that's the same number of containers week after week all year. And not only that, but they want to give it to you on the same port pair. So, you get 10 from Jamin to Charleston, 5 from Qingdao to Seattle, 8 from Yantian to New York. Well, it doesn't work that way. So if you're able to get some sort of flexibilities in your allocations and how you can apply them in this world, especially with power shortages and COVID, issues and all that, I don't think any of us are clear on when our goods are coming out of a factory at this point. It's worse than ever from that standpoint.
Appreciate that perspective, John. Frank, for me, you have a very interesting job title, especially in the logistics and supply chain industry. And obviously, we've just come off a big event in Glasgow, COP26, talking about sustainability, carbon emissions, and all of the surrounding issues associated with that. Love to hear your perspective on feeding in, reducing carbon emissions and sustainability, given some of the challenges we're seeing in this area.
It's integral to the discussion because we're talking about a short-term issue right now that's dramatically impacting the rest of the world, the entire supply chain. But it's indicative of a systemic problem with ocean freight industry. Before COVID, everyone was predicting that the ocean freight industry would scale between now and 2050 to 55 between 300 to 400%. And, John from Perch pointed out earlier that, you add a new on-ramp, or you add sufficient capacity in some aspects of the supply chain, you've just created a problem later on. We have a severe problem with port infrastructure, port capacity, and other things. This ties to environment because we're seeing if we don't start managing CO2 emissions, not only in the vessels, but also what we're doing in terms of air quality, air emissions in ports, and the impact on development by failing to resolve some of these ports capacity issues. It has a big problem on the environment and a big problem on sustainability impact. At the same time, all these issues with port capacities are happening. There's about to be a big revolution in bunkering technology and bunkering infrastructure. When the industry converts to ammonia or hydrogen or something else like that, what's going to how does that play into this problem with the port's capacity? So what we don't want to do as an industry is see this short-term problem, which has turned into a global crisis, become a multi-decade interruption to transitioning to a lower CO2 emissions economy and a lower CO2 emissions industry. So we have to look at this issue systemically and say, when we have all these ships floating offshore, what's that doing to air quality at the ports? What's it doing to quality of life? What's it doing to sustainability and economic development? And we need to start addressing these issues now, because 30 years from now, it could create really, really big problems for development and environment.
Definitely appreciate that. It's definitely a topic that sometimes does get neglected with some of these short-term issues that we're seeing all around the world. Jamin, you mentioned some really interesting points earlier around, say, buffer stock. Would love to hear more broadly, what are some of the ways that you assess and evaluate whether to leverage backup plans like buffer stocks or, say, air freight versus ocean freight?
Yeah, I think we always recommend businesses have several backup plans in their arsenal. And I think part one is to actually plan for disruption. So what do we do if there's a port delay or I can't get capacity? But I think what's even more important than that, I think enough people are doing that. The harder thing is to know when it's time to pull the trigger on those plans. And I've seen people have great plans, but then you don't know exactly when to launch it. And I think in the current situation, if you wait too long, if you're on the back end of people understanding that you have to now switch to another port or move to air, then you're in the same situation, because you don't have that kind of, if you've waited too long, you don't have the ability to just jump on a solution. So I think it's really understanding what are the conditions for my business that I need to have in order to execute that change, and not having a lot of delay in that. So we think, for instance, certainty of delivery may outweigh the cost of freight for some people. And so understanding that and figuring out what part of your supply chain needs to be optimized to make sure you're delivering for your customers is super important. So yeah, I think it's having the backup plan, but also having the internal analysis of when are we going to pull the trigger on that is super important.
Definitely. I think a Mike Tyson quote does spring to mind, given what you just mentioned, Jamin. John, would love to hear your perspective at Perch on how you assess different backup plans and when to pull the trigger, to Jamin's points there.
I think we live in backup plans. I think even before this, honestly, even before this in this industry, you already lived in backup plans. The real talents that I've had the opportunity to work with over the years are people that they've always got a plan B, C, D, whatever it might be, right? And of course now, what is our backup plan in case of labor issues next year on the West Coast of the United States, should there be some sort of disruption further. And I've, again, speaking with people in the industry, I've heard they've already seen a dramatic increase in volumes and the way things are being contracted for next year into the East Coast. And carriers are adding vessels, and they're adding them on the East Coast, and that's because of this demand, which may be temporary demand. Carriers move vessels around all the time, and so I think we live to a large extent in backup plans and tell me what my problem is next week, and I'll tell you what my backup plan is. I don't mean to be, a wise guy, but in general, we're confronted with the next unknown because of the ripple effect that we've talked about, and that forces us to get creative. We got in my previous role, we got a lot in LA. We went and rented a lot to put our containers in because we couldn't bring them back to the terminal. So those are the kinds of things that you need, because we didn't have room for more containers in our fulfillment centers. So things of that nature. Maybe moving fulfillment out of Canada down into the US, as an example, is an option. Maybe that's for next year. Someone mentioned Port Prince Rupert. Love the Port Prince Rupert routing that goes down into Memphis versus coming over LA. It's a great transit time. Something I've always, sorry, just kind of wrap up the thought. I mean, you always come across things. We're always learning. We kind of hear about something, we make note of it, and we keep track of it. And guess what? We're going to start using that Port Prince Rupert routing into Memphis as an example. So you just have to be paying attention all the time.
Definitely. You mentioned those upcoming contract negotiations. Would love to hear a little bit more about that. And for maybe the folks that are unaware, what kind of impact you see that potentially having?
Is that directed to me?
Yes.
Okay.
Lisa.
Yeah, sure. I think it's going to have an impact in the first half of the year, with especially emphasized by the challenges we've been through and the challenges of not having your inventory in place where it needs to be for the peak. My uneducated estimate and view is, who wants to be the logistics executive that's explaining to their leadership next year that, well, I really didn't think that there was going to be an issue, and I guess there is now, and sorry, we don't have any inventory for Christmas. So I think people are going to bring their inventory in earlier. Typically, nothing ever happens when if I understand correctly, the contract expires, I think, on July 2nd. Typically, in my experience, and I've negotiated labor contracts, it doesn't, any issues don't happen effectively on the day the contract expires, as long as everybody feels they're working together. I think it's a great time, if I was a longshoreman, to be negotiating. And I mean, I guess what we all hope for is that everybody can work it out smoothly and create as little disruption to our supply chains as possible. But I think an artificial impact, another artificial cycle, not your normal 12-month cycle, is going to be, people are going to go heavier to bring their volume in, March, April, May, to get ahead of any theoretical slowdowns or disruption. And they're going to go heavier to the East Coast, as mentioned.
Definitely something that definitely folks should have on their calendars for next year if they don't already. John, just from a Lognet perspective, what are some of the ways that maybe technology can be leveraged to assess and evaluate whether to leverage these backup plans that John and Jamin mentioned?
One of the neat things about the technology is that today we can ingest all kinds of data and constantly reevaluate the whether or not to go to a backup plan, because you don't, unfortunately, in logistics, it's such a wonderful industry to be in. You don't know where your next excitement is going to come from. So it could be at an origin, an interchange point, all these different locations. It could be at the discharge port. It's LA, it gets in the news today, but the port of Tianjin might blow up the next day. They might swallow up half of Thailand with a tidal wave the day afterwards. So there's always a potpourri of options for us. We're really strong believers, and it's pointing back to, I think, what was really important from Jamin's earlier comments of the 6 points that we look at: production, documentation, transport. If you're not connected end to end and checking all of that, so when Indonesia had a lockdown, a lot of customers said, "Hey, we got to get our Christmas goods out of Indonesia early," and they had to contact their production departments, get the goods manufactured and out of there before they had that lockdown. That movement created a bubble. The customers that instantly connected that to a distribution issue down the road are the ones that avoided the challenges of LA. And so to his point of when do you decide to pull the trigger, the really the good KPIs that are set up end to end that are linking all those different aspects, as soon as that those production issues decisions were being made, we have customers that were really well integrated and did some really creative activity right months ago when that lockdown occurred.
Definitely appreciate those points, John. Before we move on, Frank, I'd love to hear your perspective on how you see this issue of, assessing and evaluating when to pull the trigger on some of these backup plans.
I think to second what the two Johns have said is, it's the idea of integration and collaboration, having more visibility and more awareness across the entire, across the value chain or across the supply chain. That gives you the information you need to go to plan B. I mean, ideally, you don't want to go to plan B because you're going to eat into your margins. We're in business for business, and plan B is not a good way to get around. So, try to make sure you don't get to plan B in the first place. And if you do get to plan B, make sure you have enough data and information to make a good decision. And that comes from integrating all your information, and it comes from collaborating with your supply chain partners to become aware of, what's happening with production, as John said, and what's happening with demand and the intermediate organizations in between. If you're not integrated and you're not collaborating, it's problematic.
Definitely. So when it comes to these current challenges, it does feel like folks are, putting out fires on a daily basis, and it's hard to look, say, long term. But Jamin, just from your perspective, what are some of the longer term strategies that companies can leverage to, say, get ahead of some of these challenges that we've seen in ports and other things over, say, the last 18 to 24 months?
Sure. I think I've mentioned shipping in advance and, building in buffer times and buffer stock. These things are, I consider those to be more short term. And so to your point, what do you do about the long term? And I think one is just developing longer term freight relationships with contractual service commitments rather than trying to surf the spot market. I think if you're out there right now trying to just do your best to compare and find available capacity, you're probably in a lot of pain right now because it's people with the relationships that are longer term that have specific service commitments, about getting rolled onto the next vessel, or how do they have block space agreements for air and things like that. So I think that's a really important thing, is just pushing out that threshold for developing those contractual relationships. And I think John from Perch mentioned, you better start doing that now for next year. So the contracting period is moving up. So I think getting the jump on that is a long-term strategy that you need to be thinking about. And then the second thing, I won't rehash what others said about integration and collaboration and visibility in the supply chain, but you can't have a long-term strategy that doesn't include that. I think it's just absolutely essential. So I fully agree with what others have said. And then I think the last thing I would add is finding diversity in your suppliers themselves. So if you're bringing things in from one country and you're 100% dependent on that, that's a risk. And, so I think some of the smarter companies right now are thinking about, how do I de-risk that? Can I develop some supply options that are outside of one country and are in another country, and that I can switch over to in case this lasts longer than we hope?
Definitely great points, Jamin. Frank, I'd love to hear your perspective on these longer term strategies, and as well how to incorporate sustainability within that process as well.
Long term, it's critical to incorporate sustainability. There's what we found in our business is there is a correlation between supply chain cost and carbon. And it's not just, the effect of potential carbon taxation that is coming, but just the actual spend. The more you spend on fuel, the more your costs will likely increase. Anything going faster is probably going to cost more. Ocean freight is by far the least environmentally impactful and cheapest way of moving cargo. But it has a long lead time, so you have to plan around it. So for long term, know the impact. Start looking at sustainability now. Start looking at CO2, because if you find high CO2 impact, you're going to likely find high cost impact as well. So make sure that you're building that in. Know the market, know the product. Know what you need to ship and what you don't need to ship. Know what you should be producing locally to reduce environmental impact and also preserve or reduce costs is very, very important. Understand your market demand and your market supply, and paying attention to consumer behaviors as well. Consumer behaviors are changing. You don't want to be carrying a lot of inventory that consumers won't support because of the environmental impact from that inventory. But these are very, very important issues, and everyone in this call who's working in supply chain should be looking at sustainability as a means to identify supply chain weaknesses and also look for opportunities for improvement.
Perfect. Appreciate that, Frank. John, just from the Perch perspective, I feel like you've already mentioned some great points here around some longer term planning, but do you have any other advice on some of these longer term, say, looking further than 2 years out, that companies can leverage to help with these disruptions we're seeing?
Well, I guess, part of that answer is you have to know where you're going, right? I in my previous role, where I, like I said, we went from 25,000. I mean, I started an entity that didn't exist 4 years earlier, Castlegate Global Logistics at Wayfair, right? And now they're moving 75,000 roughly containers a year is the global rate. We had a pretty good sense that we were going to grow, or scale. I'm not sure if we knew we were going to scale that much. And honestly, part of that scale happened because we have our people that sell through Wayfair. They own the goods, and they were typically using their own methods to move their containers. And those methods for that small BCO completely disappeared last year. Carriers won't contract. A year ago, when I was talking with carriers, it was 500 containers or less. They weren't giving any contracts. I've actually had a carrier, one of the first carriers that I was talking to last month said, yeah, we're not signing any contracts for less than 2,500 containers this year. So that takes that really long tail, the large population of people, and just tosses them to the side because they can no longer get on the vessel, right? And combined with that, the carrier also said, and we're not taking any new named accounts. So you can go to a freight forwarder with your business. So Perch could go to a freight forwarder and say, hey, I want to use you to move my containers for me. Can you put me on your contract with said carrier as a named account? A couple problems there. One, it locks you into one carrier. Theoretically, maybe you can go to multiple carriers, but you give up some flexibility there. Two, it's a flat rate volume, and without getting too far into it, the idea is you go and you get put on as a named account, and carriers aren't accepting new named accounts on their freight forwarder NVOCC contracts, and so kind of got off track there a little bit. But you got to know where you're going and how big. If you're going to plan long term, you've got to have a sense of what you're going to look like in 3 or 4 years, and obviously that comes right from the top of the company. I guess if I was going to make a mistake right now, I'd plan on the side of being bigger. Because it's just a mess right now, right? I mean, let's call it what it is. I wanted to, if I could, talk about Frank and talk about sustainability a little bit. I had the pleasure to travel around the world, and if you want to come back to this, Nick, I'll defer to your other questions. I don't want to take over.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly, going around the world to set up a freight entity, as I had done previously and for the last 5 years, you got to see different things. One of the things I was fascinated by was in Europe, and I'll use Felixstowe as an example. It's not the only place this is the case, where they feather out multiple shorter length trains into the inland of the UK, but all over the UK. So there might be, 8-10 trains shorter in length that go out to other stations, rail ramps, where you can transfer the containers onto a chassis. That does a couple of things. One, it reduces the number of trucks that are in port, reduces the amount of diesel trucks that are running up the highway and polluting, because the train is a better advantage, right? And also, when in the world of equipment challenges like chassis shortages, in drivers, you've got one driver that probably, so we were up in the Lutterworth area. So we go to a rail ramp there. It might be 20 miles versus a 2.5 hour drive, right? So now that one driver can probably do 3 or 4 transactions a day, and he might even only need 2 chassis to do 3 or 4 transactions. So you need less equipment. You have you need fewer drivers. You have far less pollution. And I'm fascinated by that because we're obsessed in the United States with these trains that are big and long and go into the heartland. If you look at Charleston, they have a rail that goes into Greer to get the containers off port, and everybody kind of dismissed that not a couple of years ago. There's Austell, Georgia, off of Savannah. But I was in a meeting with Gene Soroka, the director of the Port of Los Angeles, at the last TPM, and he's like, "What you guys need to do, what you all need to do, is you need to get together and get a short rail to the Inland Empire. It's about 60 miles off port, in where all the warehouses are, and get the containers off port and move them to an inland point. You need fewer drivers, less congestion, et cetera." And I don't think anything's done to make that happen, but that was Gene's point. It's a little bit of a challenge in LA, not getting too far down the rabbit hole, but there's multiple terminals in LA, whereas Charleston, Felixstowe, and Savannah are one entity that have better control over it. But anyhow, these are the kinds of things that, from a long-term planning standpoint and maybe infrastructure standpoint, are easier solves because the rail exists already than maybe some of the other infrastructure changes that are, not in my career lifetime, put it that way, right?
Appreciate that, John. Yeah, I think it's great points on the sustainability, which is such an important issue. John, from the Lognet perspective, would love to hear how you see efficiency and sustainability, to use that word again, feed into some of these issues and challenges that you're seeing, and solutions to overcome those challenges as well.
I think we've definitely hit a tipping point where you have to be greenhouse gas conscious. And I think that we're going to evolve, and it'll probably be, unfortunately, because of a carbon tax, but we have the ability to rate every single container, truck, carton, and give it a carbon load. That's, we've got very mature technology to do that. And it's just raising the awareness to a tipping point where it isn't a nice to have, but it's essential. And people are understanding that we have to do it. We have to know how much carbon each movement is doing. And then when you evaluate transportation options, you're evaluating along with the cost. They are closely correlated. But what is specifically the carbon footprint going to be? And if you have to add to that cost in order to take a higher carbon load on a specific move, that's just should be required. I think some of the efficiencies longer term that Jamin talked of, contracting, I think that's going to take a big change, because time usually is not in ocean carrier contracts. So if they decide to offload your cargo on the way to the destination, there isn't anything typically that's in there that says the bill of lading requires you to deliver this at any certain time. So I think the number of port calls that a given journey is going to include, that's important to get onto your bookings and your contracts, and the amount of time that it takes to deliver the cargo needs to be on there to help balance the carrier's propensity to optimize their revenue and also make sure that they're held accountable on a service basis.
Definitely great points. I think it's really interesting to have that visibility over the carbon footprint of what you're doing. Frank, I saw you nodding along there. It'd be interesting for you to just discuss with us here on that balance of understanding the carbon footprint and also understanding the cost, because they don't always kind of work in the same direction.
Yeah, we're able to move a lot of stuff now without really considering the cost of carbon, and that's rapidly changing. It will rapidly change in the next 5 years or so. People will are starting to price carbon now. It will become more apparent, and solutions like what John and the Lognet team are offering are very real necessities in the supply chain, and we have to start thinking about that as professionals. That we have to start looking at what the CO2 implications are for the decisions we're making, because that will directly impact the cost of the goods served to the consumers. We are in a time of great change and a great transition right now. We don't necessarily realize it now. We're focusing on port congestion right now. But as we go in to solve this problem with port congestion and supply chain disruption, we have to start also thinking about, hey, what's going on here? How can I become more aware of the long-term implications of what I'm doing, and what solutions can I implement now to make sure I'm aware, I have that visibility and awareness to make better decisions. It's critically important. It's coming a lot faster than I think much of us. There's a lot, looking at the people, my counterparts on this panel, none of us are spring chickens. We have to start thinking and getting ready for this transition.
Great points. Yeah, I'm very excited personally to see how that evolves over the coming months and years. We've spoken a lot here about technology and data and all of those terms that are staples of every webinar that you do on this kind of topic. But I think it's really important to emphasize the relationship and collaboration aspect of these things. Jamin, just from your perspective, how important do you see collaboration and relationships with partners to help you minimize some of these disruptions that we're all seeing?
Yeah, I think this is a key focus for us and for our customers, because the ecosystem of players in any movement cross border, it's bigger and more complex than it used to be. And so I think from an operational standpoint, being very aware of who those players are, what the service requirements are for each of them, but having a relationship that you've built with them over time, I think, is super important. So I think the days of sort of an arm's length relationship have, they're behind us, because we have to know, what's their technology roadmap? How does it fit in with what we're doing? And does it match what our customers need? Does our contract match what our business needs are? So that's sort of an operational side of things. But on the digitization side, again, not to overemphasize this, but it is so important that you can't have effective collaboration right now without thinking about how to digitize your relationship with providers. Yeah, so that's for us. We think about the trade data is digitally transmitted to our partners, and then throughout the supply chain, that information then is transmitted to our importers and buyers. And so I think there's an operational element to this, but the digitization element of collaboration is absolutely critical. And so I think those are sort of the two prongs I think about when we're thinking how to ensure collaboration is happening.
Perfect. Appreciate that, Jamin. John, from the Perch perspective and also from your personal perspective, how important do you see relationship and collaboration to overcome some of these challenges that we're all seeing?
It's a relationship business. It's huge. And sometimes they're not the direct carrier relationship that we're, that's a critical relationship, with your carrier, your vendor partners. But I've got a great document. There's a gentleman by the name of James Caradona, who was accompanied by the name of M&R Speedog, and he issues a Trans-Pacific eastbound trade document every month. And I consume that one. As soon as I see it, like in my inbox, I consume it within 5 minutes, because he's second generation on the Trans-Pacific trade, and it's the heartbeat of what's going on the Trans-Pacific trade. He's really well connected, and of course through his own network. So through him, I access his network. But also last year with contracts, we went with contracts. We had some calls. We were connected to CEOs, because we were a large client, Wayfair, CEOs of the ocean carriers. We came out of that meeting, and the COO of Wayfair, Thomas Netzer, and I kind of turned to each other and said, based on what we're hearing, we need to go for contracts now. And I think the second of the two CEO meetings we had to CEO was December 2nd. And I combined that with conversations I had with a gentleman by the name of Micah Malice down at the Port of Charleston. And he was telling me people were going early. So in the end, Thomas and I chose to sign 2 contracts before the end of the year, which was really December 25th. And we're way ahead of the market. And so the point is, that was, talk about collaboration and networking. I mean, I think people kind of think of collaboration with a lot of conversation on digitization and relationship with your carrier partners, but it's really having your ear to the ground and understanding what's going on, and, staying ahead of, so you do have that contingency plan in place, staying ahead of it because you talk to a lot of people and whatnot. So to me, it's a relationship business, and that's the most important thing, especially right now, to keep working your network and collaborating with those folks.
Really appreciate that, John. John, just from the Lognet perspective, would love to hear how you personally view this collaboration and relationship aspect of say what you guys do.
It's huge, and a lot of times we see it institutionalized in through KPIs. And I would just reemphasize the importance of end-to-end KPIs versus managing a relationship on siloed KPIs. And I think the pandemic kind of blew the doors off of needing to have collaboration and redefining collaboration to further go upstream in the supply chain and downstream, that people see all of the interconnections. And that's now sort of in vogue today in the media even. But as the media explores the fact that you can't get space in the yard, that impacts the chassis, that depends on how much the train is going to move, that depends on whether or not you have any space in the DC, that interconnected space, I think it's permeating now society, so that the senior management and areas that were maybe not as knowledgeable of logistics are getting front and center with the challenges that have always been there in logistics, but there's a deep appreciation for it. And I think we're seeing a shift towards that kind of collaboration, where they're saying, you can't have a transport KPI where your vessel got there on time, so you did your job. It has to get all the way to the customer, and the customer has to be the person that everybody in the supply chain is worried about.
Really appreciate that. Just goes to show how front and center supply chain is in the world right now. As we wrap up, obviously what we've discussed here, many of the points are quite doom and gloom with all the challenges that we are seeing. But if we can, I'd love to go around the virtual room and ask everyone on a positive note, in light of what we've discussed today, what excites you about the future of supply chain? So starting off with Frank with that one.
I'm hugely excited and hugely bullish about supply chain. I do believe that we're entering a revolutionary time period for supply chain due to the advent and growth of technology, automation, but also sustainability. And what excites me is that now we as supply chain professionals have an opportunity to think big, like really big. And John from Perch noted, people are thinking, okay, what about smaller train loads coming out of ports and stuff like that? And I think that's great. Another example of that is in Sharjah and Dubai, they're talking about using Hyperloop in ports. It's like now is the time that we can actually think about really, really cool, innovative technologies that will, vastly improve the quality of life through supply chain. Supply chain is a big part of development. So it's a great opportunity to look at supply chain efficiency, optimization, and sustainability across all modes. Looking at, we're seeing new, Agility's investing in really, really cool zero emissions trucking technologies, which are going to be on the road really soon. Like really, really cool stuff. We're looking at, train, we're seeing a lot of stuff, airplanes are probably in a matter of a decade or so are going to be flying on synth fuel. Like very, very innovative technologies are going to come out that are going to have positive sustainability impact, positive development impact, and really, really good supply chain development overall. So it's quite an exciting time. And I would say it's a great opportunity for everyone attending this call to think big and drive and get some really good impact out of it.
Appreciate that rallying cry, Frank. Next up, John from Perch, would love to hear what excites you about the future of this industry.
I think a lot of what Frank just said. I mean, what's tomorrow bring, right? One of the biggest dilemmas, and I'm fascinated by this in the industry, is long-term planning. I mean, these ports, they dredge, they put in new docks and bigger docks and bring in cranes, and their thought process is, okay, well, this is a 25-year capital investment project that becomes obsolete because they don't. Who knew they were going to go from a 10,000 TEU vessel to a 15,000 TEU vessel, and now they need bigger cranes and different cranes. And a fun fact, by the way, as a side note, I was told by my colleague Micah down in the port of Charleston, if you buy 4 cranes, you get the 5th one free. Who knew that there was a volume discount on cranes? But anyway, and so this is all fascinating. How do you stay ahead of that? How do you anticipate? And some of these are government-run ports, and some of them are private, and it's crazy and it's fun. I mean, it really is. At the end of the day, I think you can't be the type of person that wants to play a passive game. You got to kind of be right in the middle of it and have fun with it. So I don't know, whatever's up tomorrow that's different is going to be exciting.
Definitely, and I'm sure a number of people are now rushing to buy some cranes after what you just mentioned there, John. So I appreciate that. And Jamin, would love to hear your perspective on what excites you about the future of this industry.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. I mean, based on the history of supply chain, I think it's the kinds of challenges that we're seeing right now that force the best innovation. And so, yeah, we're in a crisis right now, but I think it's forcing new ideas to the table, and they're starting to emerge. And people are seeing that, if we invest in the right kind of technology, and we start to think about how to upgrade our infrastructure and de-risk, different failure points in the supply chain, we're going to come out of this, I think, with a much stronger global supply chain than we have today. To me, that's extremely exciting. I think we're in for, it's going to be tough for a while, but I think we're in for better days after that. We're going to be forcing ourselves to do things smarter, and hopefully, governments and ports around the world will join us in that, and we can end up, collectively with something that works a lot better.
Excellent. Appreciate that, Jamin. And last but not least, John from Lognet, would love to hear your perspective on what excites you about the future of this industry.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has been a terrific catalyst. I mean, look at us. We're here with you today, Nick. Reuters talking about supply chain, buying cranes, talking about transshipment. I mean, how cool is that? That all these topics that were, a lexicon all to ourselves, now working their way. And before you know it, they'll be talking about detention and demerge, and know the difference between the two at dinner time. So I think that's a tremendous explosion. And the thing it did for us that I'm really excited about is, we do the autonomous side of the supply chain, which is, approving bookings and getting equipment and all these sundry things automatically. And before, that was something you alpha tested, and that was going to be somebody who was doing bleeding edge things. Now it's a necessity, and customers are jumping in that direction, not holding back. And I think to Frank's point about sustainability, it's a tremendous catalyst to say the technology's there. Let's put it to use. Let's change. And I like the thought of John, thinking big. I think that's very true. And Frank sort of reiterated that, and that's what really has me excited.
Excellent. Appreciate that, John. Well, 58 minutes I've flown by. My thanks to all of today's speakers for taking their time out of an extremely busy schedule, considering everything that's going on in the current world of supply chain. I hope that everyone found this useful, and I hope as well that everyone can join us really, really soon for another Reuters Events webinar. Until next time.